The words that build or break us. Why what you say in old age matters more than ever. As we grow older, something unexpected begins to happen. It's not just our bodies that change or our daily routines that slow down, it's our voices. Not in volume or tone, but in the weight our words carry. Every sentence we speak in our later years echoes a little louder, lands a little heavier, and lingers a little longer in the hearts of those who hear it. And yet, we rarely stop to ask ourselves, are my words bringing me closer to the people I love, or quietly pushing them away? You see, it's not always the grand gestures that shape our relationships. Often, it's the quiet comments, the familiar phrases, the things we say almost without thinking. Phrases like, "I'm just a burden. Back in my day. What's the point?" They may seem harmless, even honest, but over time, these words can chip away at the bonds we've spent a lifetime building. They can create invisible walls between us and the people we care most about, leaving us feeling misunderstood, unimportant, and painfully alone. But here's the good news, we can change that. In this article, we'll explore 6 seemingly simple phrases that, when spoken too often, can sabotage our connections, especially as we age. Through Buddhist insights, real-life stories, and practical reframes, we'll uncover how to replace language that isolates with words that heal, invite, and empower. This isn't just about communication, it's about dignity. It's about learning to speak in a way that honors not only who we are, but who we've become. Because you are not a burden. You are not invisible. And your words still have the power to shape the world around you. So if you've ever felt distant from your children, unheard by your grandchildren, or quietly unsure of how to stay connected in a world that moves faster every year, stay with me. The journey we're about to take may not only change the way you speak, but the way you feel about yourself and your place in the lives of others. Let's begin. Phrase 1, I'm just a burden, the silent wound of self-dismissal. Few phrases carry as much quiet heartbreak as I'm just a burden. It often slips out in moments of fatigue, illness, or emotional vulnerability, when asking for help feels uncomfortable or when independence begins to fade. On the surface, it may sound like humility. But beneath it lies something far more dangerous, a quiet surrender of self-worth. The hidden damage. Saying I'm just a burden doesn't just reflect how we feel, it shapes how others feel about us and, more importantly, how they feel about themselves. Our children, caregivers, friends, they may hear those words and feel helpless, even rejected. What was meant as an expression of guilt or fear becomes an unintended message. Your care doesn't matter, or worse, you're wasting your time. In Buddhist philosophy, the value of a person is not rooted in their productivity, youth, or ability. Instead, it is based on interconnectedness, the truth that all beings are woven together in a sacred web of compassion and mutual support. To see yourself as a burden is to forget that in this web, to receive is just as sacred as to give. A Buddhist reframe. The Buddha taught that every moment of connection is a chance to cultivate metta, loving kindness. And sometimes, accepting help with grace is an act of love. It allows others to serve, to express their compassion, and to grow through giving. When we reject care, we don't just isolate ourselves, we also rob others of the joy of showing up for us. A real-life story, Miriam and Helen. Consider the story of Miriam, a 78-year-old woman who spent most of her life nurturing others. She raised 3 children, volunteered at local shelters, and was the person neighbors turned to during times of need. But in her later years, arthritis and chronic fatigue changed her daily reality. She needed help, but she hated asking for it. Every time her daughter Helen came to help her cook or run errands, Miriam would mutter, I'm just a burden to you. And each time, Helen's heart broke a little more. She never saw her mother as a burden. She saw her as her home, her anchor, her greatest teacher. But after months of hearing that phrase, Helen began to pull back, not out of resentment, but out of sadness. What could she say to someone who didn't believe they were worth loving anymore? Eventually, after one emotional conversation, Helen asked her mother, what if, instead of saying I'm a burden, you just said thank you for loving me? Miriam was quiet for a long time. But the next time Helen came by with groceries, she looked up and whispered, "Thank you for loving me." That small shift opened the door to healing. Rewriting the script. Instead of, "I'm just a burden," try saying, "Thank you for being here. Your support means so much to me." This small reframe doesn't deny your vulnerability, but it honors the relationship. It reminds you, and them, that love is not measured by ease or convenience, it is measured by presence. Why this phrase hurts more than we think. Growing up, I watched my grandmother fall into this trap. After her stroke, she needed help for even the simplest things. I remember her apologizing every time I handed her a cup of tea or helped her with her coat. "I'm so sorry. I hate being a burden," she'd say with a forced smile. But I never saw her that way. I saw her as the woman who taught me how to tie my shoes, who told me stories that lit up my imagination, who made holidays magical. When she called herself a burden, it wasn't just painful, it was untrue. That phrase is a mirror. When we say it, we ask others to look into it and see us through the lens of self-pity or guilt. But when we speak from a place of gratitude and worth, we invite them to see us as we truly are, deeply human, deeply valuable, deeply loved. Phrase 2, back in my day, when nostalgia becomes a wall. Nostalgia is a beautiful thing. It reminds us of where we've been, what we've survived, and how far we've come. But sometimes, the way we express nostalgia creates division instead of connection, especially when it comes in the form of that well-worn phrase, "back in my day." It usually starts with good intentions. We want to share a memory, offer perspective, or pass along the hard-earned wisdom of experience. But to younger ears, especially in emotionally vulnerable moments, this phrase can sound like judgment, like comparison, like dismissal. The unseen impact. When a young person is struggling, stressed at work, overwhelmed by the pressures of parenting, or confused by modern chaos, and they hear "back in my day, we just worked hard and didn't complain," what they often feel is not guidance, but shame. It unintentionally communicates, "Your struggles are less valid than mine were." And even if that's not the intent, the result is the same, disconnection. A Buddhist lens on listening. In Buddhism, one of the highest forms of compassion is deep listening, known as karuna. The practice isn't about responding or offering advice. It's about being fully present with someone else's experience, without the need to compare it to our own. The Buddha often sat in silence as others poured out their pain. Not because he lacked wisdom, but because understanding must come before teaching. So when someone comes to us in pain, the first question shouldn't be, "How can I compare this to my past?" It should be, "How can I be present with them right now?" A real-life story, James and Sophia. James, a retired factory worker in his 70s, prided himself on never missing a day of work in 40 years. He believed in discipline, sacrifice, and grit. His granddaughter Sophia, in her early 30s, had a very different life, working remotely, juggling 2 kids, and managing rising anxiety from the demands of modern life. One evening, over dinner, Sophia opened up about feeling burnt out. "I feel like I'm drowning sometimes," she said. James, meaning to be encouraging, replied, "Back in my day, we didn't have time to drown. We just got on with it." He chuckled. She didn't. The air grew heavy. Sophia felt unseen. Not because James was cruel, but because his comment erased the very thing she was trying to share, her vulnerability. After that night, Sophia stopped opening up to her grandfather. Not because she didn't love him, but because she didn't feel safe in his presence. Rewriting the script. Instead of, "Back in my day, try." I remember facing something similar once. Would it help to hear how I handled it? This subtle shift does 2 powerful things. 1, it honors the other person's experience, rather than overriding it. 2, it invites conversation, instead of closing it. The need to be heard. I've seen this phrase build walls in my own family. I remember when I confided in an older relative about burnout during my first job. I was looking for support or even just a listening ear. Instead, I got a speech. When I was your age, we worked 14 hours a day and didn't complain. I stopped talking. Not because I didn't value their experience, but because I didn't feel like mine mattered anymore. And that's the danger of this phrase. It doesn't make your experience more valid, it just makes the other person feel smaller. The invitation. Our pasts are sacred. Our stories deserve to be told. But they should be shared not as weapons of comparison, but as bridges of empathy. If someone is opening up to you, it means they trust you. Don't let that moment slip away with a phrase that, though familiar, can quietly close a heart. Instead, become curious. Ask questions. Reflect on similarities, not superiority. Because here's the truth, every generation carries its own burdens. The shape of the struggle may change, but the weight is the same. And when we respect that, we open the door to deeper, more loving relationships. Phrase 3. What's the point? When hopelessness replaces hope. There's a kind of heaviness that comes with age, not just in the body, but sometimes in the heart. After a lifetime of giving, struggling, loving, and losing, it's easy to wake up some days and wonder, what's the point? Maybe it's whispered while sitting alone in a quiet house. Maybe it surfaces when the kids forget to call, or when your health doesn't allow you to do what you used to love. Maybe it's not even said out loud, but it's felt. And while this question can sometimes be a passing sigh of fatigue, when spoken repeatedly, it becomes a powerful declaration of despair. The psychology of what's the point? At first glance, this phrase seems like a philosophical musing. But underneath it is often a much deeper wound, disconnection from purpose. Purpose is not just about grand ambitions. In fact, according to both modern psychology and ancient Buddhist wisdom, a sense of meaning is rooted in small, daily acts of love, presence, and contribution. When we lose sight of that, we begin to shrink inside ourselves. And sadly, so do our relationships. A Buddhist reframe. The Buddha taught that suffering is part of life, but it is not the whole of life. Within suffering lies the opportunity for transformation. This is the heart of the middle way, not swinging between extremes of indulgence and denial, but finding peace in the presence of both light and shadow. So when we ask what's the point, we're not just questioning life, we're often crying out for someone to remind us that life still has something to offer us, even in its quieter chapters. Frank in the empty chair. Frank was once the life of every party. At 76, he still told the best jokes, remembered the lyrics to every Sinatra song, and had a loud, unforgettable laugh. But after his wife of 52 years passed away, that laugh disappeared. When his daughter invited him to a family picnic, he just looked at her and said, "What's the point? I'll just sit there, and everyone will be too busy anyway." What Frank didn't see was how much his absence would be felt. How his grandkids had been excited to hear him tell stories. How his daughter had spent hours making his favorite potato salad. But after hearing what's the point one too many times, the invitations became less frequent. Not out of spite, but out of sadness and helplessness. This is the hidden cost of that phrase. It doesn't just reflect a lack of motivation, it discourages others from reaching out, making the isolation even deeper. Rewriting the script. Instead of, "What's the point?" try, "I'm feeling low today, but maybe being with you could help." Or even, "What small thing could bring me a little joy right now?" These are not just linguistic tweaks. They are emotional invitations. They open the door for others to help, to connect, to walk with you through the fog rather than being shut out by it. Small sparks of meaning. A few years ago, I met an elderly man named Walter during a hospice visit. He was soft-spoken, rarely made eye contact, and often said, "I'm just waiting for the end." But one day, I brought him a watercolor kit. At first, he resisted. "What's the point of painting now?" he grumbled. But I sat down beside him and began to paint a clumsy little sunflower. He watched. Then, slowly, he picked up a brush. For weeks after that, Walter painted. Sloppy at first, then softer, more confident strokes. He ended up gifting one of his paintings to a nurse who had taken care of him. She cried. That's the thing, We don't need a grand reason to keep going, just a small spark of connection, beauty, or kindness. The invitation. Asking what's the point is human. But staying in that question, repeating it until it becomes your truth, can steal away the joy still available to you. Instead, start with this. What could bring me a little peace, beauty, or joy today, even for 5 minutes? The answer doesn't have to be profound. Maybe it's a warm drink, a favorite song, a call to an old friend, or just sitting outside and feeling the breeze. The point is to stay open, because even when we don't feel it, life is still reaching out to us. Phrase 4, you wouldn't understand, when protection becomes isolation. Some words are spoken not to push people away, but to protect ourselves from being seen too closely. You wouldn't understand is one of them. It often comes from a place of exhaustion, fear, or the belief that our pain is too complex or too old for others to relate to. And while this phrase may seem like a defense, what it truly becomes over time is a wall. One that doesn't just block out judgment, but also blocks out love. The invisible wall of silence. When we say you wouldn't understand, we're making a decision on someone else's behalf. We're saying, you don't have what it takes to meet me in my pain. And that's dangerous, not just because it keeps others out, but because it teaches us that we must suffer alone. That no one can understand us, so why bother trying? But Buddhism teaches that connection doesn't require perfect understanding. What matters is presence. Compassion. The simple act of being with another person, even when words fail. As Thich Nhat Hanh wrote, the most precious gift we can offer anyone is our attention. A real-life story, Eleanor and Sarah. Eleanor, 82, had endured more than most. The loss of her husband, 3 hospitalizations in 1 year, and the loneliness of a home once filled with noise now echoing with silence. Her granddaughter Sarah, bright-eyed and full of love, visited every weekend, bringing food, helping with laundry, and trying her best to reach her grandmother's heart. But every time Sarah asked how she was doing, Eleanor would sigh and say, "You wouldn't understand." At first, Sarah tried harder. She asked more questions, offered to just sit in silence. But the door never opened. Eventually, the visits became shorter. The conversation faded. Not because Sarah loved her grandmother any less, but because there was no room left for her to stand in. Eleanor, in her attempt to protect herself from vulnerability, had also protected herself from love. The Buddhist view, vulnerability as courage. In the Dhammapada, the Buddha teaches that true strength lies not in walls, but in openness. To let someone into our inner world, especially when we are hurting, is an act of bravery. It's an act of faith, in ourselves, in them, in the idea that love is bigger than pain. We don't have to explain everything perfectly. We just have to say, "I'd like to share," if you're willing to listen. That's where healing begins. Rewriting the script. Instead of, "You wouldn't understand," try, "It's hard to talk about, but I'd like to try." Or, "I'm not sure how to explain it, but I want you here with me." These phrases invite connection instead of shutting it down. They tell the other person, "I trust you, even if you can't fix this." And that's the truth. Most of the time, people don't need to understand everything. They just need to know you're letting them walk beside you. The moment I chose to open up. I remember the moment I realized how isolating that phrase could be. I was going through one of the most difficult times of my life, and a friend asked me how I was feeling. My instinct was to say it, "You wouldn't understand." But something in her face, a softness, a quiet kind of waiting, stopped me. Instead, I said, "I don't know how to put this into words, but I want to try." She listened. Not with solutions, not with judgments, but with silence, presence, and a hand on my shoulder. I didn't need her to understand everything. I just needed her to stay. That moment changed everything for me. Because sometimes, all we really want is for someone to stay. The invitation. If you've ever felt the urge to say you wouldn't understand, pause for just a moment. Ask yourself, Is this really about their ability to understand? Or is it about my fear of being misunderstood? And if you do choose to speak, even imperfectly, know this: you are not alone. Your story, no matter how painful, deserves to be shared. Not just for your healing, but for the healing of those who love you too. Phrase 5, I'm too old for that, when age becomes an excuse to stop living fully. There's a subtle tragedy that often unfolds as we age, not because the body changes, but because the spirit begins to shrink long before it has to. I'm too old for that. It's said with a shrug, a gentle laugh, sometimes a sigh. Maybe someone invites you to try a dance class, go on a trip, learn how to use new technology, or just come to a social gathering, and that phrase slips out automatically. I'm too old for that. But what if we stop treating age like a prison sentence? What if, instead of closing doors with those 5 words, we left them just slightly ajar, long enough to let possibility peek through? What this phrase really means. Often, I'm too old for that isn't about age at all. It's about fear. Fear of failure. Fear of judgment. Fear of stepping outside what's familiar and safe. And yet, growth doesn't retire when we do. Wonder doesn't have an expiration date. A Buddhist view, the beginner's mind. In Zen Buddhism, there's a concept called Shoshin, the beginner's mind. It's the idea that we approach every moment, every opportunity, with openness, curiosity, and humility, regardless of how much we know or how many years we've lived. The Buddha taught that liberation comes from embracing life as it is, without the limits we place upon it. Even in his final years, he continued to teach, walk, meditate, and evolve. Age was never a limitation to his enlightenment. Why should it be to ours? A real-life story, Charles and the choir. Charles was 81 when his old friend invited him to rejoin the community choir they used to sing in decades ago. Back then, his voice had power. He'd been the kind of singer who made people stop mid-conversation to listen. But now, after years of silence and growing self-doubt, he declined. I'm too old for that, he said. His friend didn't argue. He respected Charles's choice, but something in him dimmed a little. And without realizing it, Charles had done more than decline an invitation. He'd quietly closed the door to joy. Months passed. The choir sang. New voices filled the room. But Charles stayed home, watching TV in the same chair, wondering why he felt a little more invisible every day. Until one afternoon, his granddaughter brought over a video of the choir's latest performance. At the end, they had dedicated a song to Charles. They missed him. That night, Charles didn't sleep well. Not out of regret, but out of realization. He wasn't too old. He was just too afraid. The next week, he showed up to rehearsal. His voice cracked. His rhythm was off. But the smile on his face? That was timeless. Rewriting the script. Instead of, I'm too old for that. Try. That's new to me, but I'm open to giving it a try. Or, tell me more. I might surprise myself. These phrases reclaim possibility. They invite experience back into your life, not for the sake of proving anything, but simply for the joy of being present and engaged. Personal insight, saying yes to life. My aunt, nearing 70, once told me she regretted how many years she'd spent saying no to adventures, to love, to change. She believed she had passed the window of excitement, that her best days were behind her. But one day, after much encouragement, she signed up for a watercolor class. She was terrible at first. And then, she fell in love with it. 2 years later, her work was featured in a local gallery. But more than that, her laughter returned. The kind of laughter that fills a room and reminds everyone that life still has gifts to give, no matter how late they arrive. That's the danger of I'm too old for that. It keeps us from unwrapping those gifts. It convinces us the story is over when in truth, a whole new chapter might be waiting to be written. The invitation. Next time you hear yourself saying, I'm too old for that, ask yourself, is this about age or about comfort? Is this a real limit or a story I've been told? What might I miss if I say no? Because every moment you say yes to a conversation, a new hobby, a reconnection with joy, you tell the world, I'm still here. I'm still becoming. And that's the most powerful thing an aging soul can declare. Phrase 6, I don't matter anymore, the deepest lie we tell ourselves in silence. Of all the phrases we've explored, I don't matter anymore is the most heartbreaking and the most dangerous. It doesn't come with fire or frustration. It comes in a whisper. In a quiet moment when the phone doesn't ring, when you walk into a room and no one looks up, when your opinions are overlooked or your presence feels invisible. This phrase isn't about one bad day. It's about the gradual erosion of significance, the sense that your life has somehow become background noise in the lives of others. But let me tell you the truth plainly. You matter. Not because of what you do, but because of who you are. Where this phrase comes from. As people age, society often shifts its focus away from them. Media celebrates youth. Families become busier. Friends pass away. And slowly, the world that once reflected your importance becomes quieter. Saying I don't matter anymore is often a symptom of this emotional dislocation. But it's not a reflection of reality, it's a false narrative whispered by loneliness. A Buddhist perspective, the inherent worth of every being. The Buddha taught that every being has intrinsic value. Not because of what they produce, or what roles they fulfill, but simply because of their presence and their potential to embody compassion, wisdom, and mindfulness. You don't need to lead, to teach, to perform, or to serve in any obvious way to have meaning. In the stillness of your being, your memory, your essence, your love, you anchor others to their own humanity. The teachings also remind us of the concept of interbeing, the idea that your very existence is woven into the fabric of others' lives, whether you see it or not. A real-life story, Lorraine and the Living Legacy. Lorraine was 83 when she began saying those words. Her husband had passed away 5 years earlier. Her body, once strong and agile, now struggled with everyday tasks. Her voice had grown softer, her presence more withdrawn. When her children or grandchildren visited, she would often say, "Don't waste your time. I don't matter anymore." It hurt more than they let on. Her son, especially, would sit in the car after each visit and cry. He remembered the mother who held his hand on the first day of school, who stayed up all night sewing his Halloween costume, who sat on the porch and whispered advice about love and heartbreak. He wanted to scream, "You still matter to me." But he didn't know how to reach her. Then one day, his teenage daughter, the youngest of Lorraine's grandchildren, brought over a scrapbook. Inside were photos, drawings, and handwritten notes from each family member. At the center was a message in bold letters. "You are the heart of us." Lorraine cried for the first time in years. Not out of sadness, but out of the quiet realization that she had never stopped mattering. She had just stopped seeing it. Rewriting the script. Instead of, "I don't matter anymore," try, "Sometimes I feel invisible, but I want to feel connected." Or even, "I'm not sure where I fit in right now, but I'd like to find out." These words don't deny the struggle. They name it with honesty while still reaching out with vulnerability. They give others a way back into your life. And more importantly, they give you permission to keep showing up. Personal insight, presence is enough. I once sat beside a woman in a senior home who hadn't spoken much in weeks. Her children rarely visited. She often stared out the window, repeating, "I'm not needed anymore." But one afternoon, a little boy from a visiting school group sat beside her. He didn't say a word, he just handed her a drawing he'd made. A clumsy sketch of her face. She looked at it. Then at him. Then she smiled. In that moment, her presence mattered. Her smile mattered. She didn't have to say anything profound or do anything grand. She just had to be. That's the truth Buddhist teachings whisper to us. To be alive is to matter. To be present is to give. To be seen, even just once, is to remind someone else of their own soul. The invitation. So if you've ever thought, I don't matter anymore, I invite you to pause. Take a breath. Look around you. Think of the lives you've touched, the stories only you carry, the love still growing quietly in the people who remember you, even when they forget to say it. And then ask, how can I invite connection back into my life? Because you are not a burden. You are not too old. You are not invisible. You are still becoming. And you still belong. Conclusion: words as bridges or walls, the choice is ours. As we journey through the later chapters of life, we come to understand a truth that is both humbling and empowering. Our words matter more than ever. They are not just expressions of thought or emotion. They are tools, delicate yet powerful, that shape how we connect, how we heal, and how we are remembered. I'm just a burden. Back in my day. What's the point? You wouldn't understand. I'm too old for that. I don't matter anymore. Each of these phrases carries a story beneath it, a longing, a fear, a quiet ache for love or validation. But when spoken too often, they begin to build invisible walls between us and the people who care. They cast shadows over our sense of purpose, making it harder for light to come in. And yet, there's another way. Buddhist philosophy reminds us that speech is a reflection of the heart, and that mindful words can be seeds of joy, understanding, and compassion. We are taught that even in silence, the way we choose to relate to others, through listening, presence, and openness, can transform not only our relationships, but our very experience of aging. The Dharma of speech, choosing intention over habit. The Buddha didn't ask us to be perfect. He asked us to be aware. To speak not out of fear or resignation, but from the deep well of truth within us. When we pause before speaking, when we ask ourselves, is this helpful? Is this kind? Is this necessary? We change the energy we bring into the room. We shift from surviving to connecting. From protecting to inviting. Every phrase we explored in this article has an antidote. A mindful alternative that opens the heart rather than closing it. Instead of I'm just a burden, try thank you for loving me. Instead of back in my day, try I'd love to share something I learned, if you'd like to hear it. Instead of what's the point, try what could bring me a little joy today. Instead of you wouldn't understand, try this is hard to explain, but I'd like to try. Instead of I'm too old for that, try that's new to me, tell me more. Instead of I don't matter anymore, try sometimes I feel invisible, but I want to reconnect. Each shift may seem small, but it plants a seed of connection. And with enough care and intention, those seeds grow into bonds stronger than words. A final story, the legacy of language. There's an old Zen story about a monk who, nearing death, was asked what he wanted his final teaching to be. The monk smiled, touched the earth gently, and said, "Tell them I was here." Sometimes, that's all we want, to be known, remembered, and cherished. Your words are your legacy. They will echo in your children's memories, and your grandchildren's hearts, and the way others choose to speak after hearing you. You are not fading. You are imprinting. So as you move through each day, ask yourself, what kind of connection do I want to create? What kind of emotional home am I building with my words? How can I speak from love instead of fear? Because it's never too late to change how we speak. And it's never too late to change how we are heard. You still matter. Your stories still matter. And your words? They still have the power to lift hearts, mend wounds, and bring people home. So speak them with love. Speak them with courage. And above all, speak them like you still believe in your own beautiful place in this world.